my mouth and the meditation of every present heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You created us for yourself, O Lord, and our souls do not rest until they rest in you. It's a famous line from church history, from church teaching. It was written by a man called Augustine of Hippo. He was a bishop of the church. He was the great theologian of his day. He was probably the person more responsible for what we understand as Christianity in the Western world more than anyone else. But saints are made. They're not born. Now, Augustine could have been faithful from his youth, and certainly his mother tried for that to be the way for him. His mother, her name was St. Monica, or Santa Monica, if you find that familiar. She was a devout Christian. His father was a pagan, and, well, Augustine was just, let's say, interested in everything. Interested in Christianity, interested in this Roman Empire in which he was growing up in, interested in all the philosophies that had trickled down from the Greeks. He was interested in Stoicism, Platonism. He was interested even in the wisdom that came from the East, Manichaeism, where he wound up for quite some time. But amongst all those things, he was also interested, well, let's say, in the more finer parts of disregarding God. His famous line being once a prayer that he offered, "O Lord, give me chastity, but just not yet." It was the case that instead of getting married as St. Monica would have wanted, he entered into what was called a concubinage for 15 years. That was kind of like an informal marriage with a woman, not quite so serious and definitely not blessed by a priest. And they had a child together, but even in those times, his heart, amongst other things, yearned for other things. In fact, he remembers one sinful episode in particular. This had nothing to do with the passions of the flesh, but it told him everything he needed to know about his own sinful nature. St. Augustine, when he was a young man, with a group of other young men, climbed the wall, the fence between the property of his and the property of their neighbor, and they stole some pears. Now, I know that doesn't sound like the worst sin, but for Augustine, the revelation he had was, well, partly because the pears were bad and they couldn't eat them anyway, that it wasn't really about stealing the pears, but there was something in that excitement of fleeing from what was right into what was wrong, into what was promising and tempting that lured him in. And Augustine struggled so much with everything that the world had to offer him. Not because he was disinterested in God and concepts like good and evil, far from it, because he was seeking and he was searching for the answers and for the way. And young people do that. In fact, I think you could say not just young people, but people actually, we tend to do that throughout the whole of our lives. Even people that don't admit it to themselves. We seek and we wonder because our minds are exploded like the size of the universe itself, trying to grasp what is and what can be. And Augustine, throughout his young adulthood, tried to take it all in. But he heard that whisper. He heard that call. He had that unstilled, restless soul rumbling within him that was seeking something that he did not know the answer for just yet. But he would get there. We were created for yourself, O Lord, and our souls are restless until they rest in you. He wrote that as the first and opening line to his famous work, The Confessions. Confessions of those past actions, confessions of that wandering, confessions of who he was and how he became who he became. A soul that was at peace. A soul that was fulfilled, a soul that was at rest. Today, we'll look a little bit at these two next solas of those 5 Lutheran solas, the onlys, these sort of hallmarks of the Reformation. For today, it's sola fide, which means faith alone, and sola Deo Gloria, which means to God alone be the glory. Now, this is not something new that emerged with Augustine. In fact, Paul in his day was finding that same wonder and searching amongst the people of Athens. The portion of Acts that we heard from today, Paul is in Athens, and it says that the people are just so enamored with the idea of listening to rhetoric and searching for truth that they'll take anyone up on the hilltop just to hear what they have to say. And so Paul has his opportunity. And he points out all of the great many temples and statues to gods that are all throughout Athens. And he tells the people that he understands just how religious they are, how searching they are. Now, prior to this, when he enters into Athens, it's described that Paul is actually distressed by all of this. And I think he should rightly be distressed. But not because these people are worshiping the wrong God, but because they're still searching. Because they're still trying to find that truth and that answer, and they're grasping at everything. So much so that they have consecrated an altar to an unknown God. That's how much they wonder. That's how much they search for that thing to cling to, for their restless soul to find rest in. And so Paul, with his opportunity there on the mount, tells them about a different kind of God. The God maybe that they're talking about in this unknown God of this altar, but a God who really doesn't need an altar like that. A God who doesn't need the service of hands, a God who doesn't need a temple guard, a God who doesn't actually even need you and what you bring, your grain offerings, your first offerings, your hardest works, but a God simply that needs you to believe, to have faith. A very different and strange kind of God for those Athenians there, just as it was really sort of a strange God in Augustine's day, where they worshiped many of the same types of gods across the Roman Empire. And Paul makes his pitch to these people, and some of them find it persuasive, and some of them find their truth, but they all listen because they're all searching. Sometimes we equate faith, and this is the bedrock of faith, but sometimes we equate faith simply with this idea of believing. Now, for sola fide, it is our salvation that is received through this faith. We receive the faith even itself, and by believing, and simply believing, our God grants us salvation. But faith has a second component to it. Because when we understand that we're saved, when we understand all that God has done for us, when we no longer worry in the way that we are bound to worry about what we have to do, how we have to serve, or exactly what the truth is, then faith propels us to go do, and faith changes our lives. For Paul, that was the faith received when he was blinded on the road to Damascus. And he changed his life from Hebrew of Hebrews into the great evangelist of the Gentiles. For Augustine, it was the change that occurred when he finally received the faith of Christ, and he transitioned from being one who was restless and wandering to one who was called by God to show the world the word in a different way, to show them God. Sola Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. Paul is distressed in this city that he is walking through, not simply because they worship the wrong God, but because they don't glorify the God, this God that they don't know yet. They cannot place this God first within their hearts and minds and soul. They cannot understand the relationship that this God intended for them. They cannot understand that their very creation by the living God means that the whole intention of their life is to be united with that very God. And Paul is distressed by the distress that they feel, the distress that Augustine felt. And dare I say, the distress that the world still very much encounters. Sometimes we can look out into our world and we can think that that flame has been extinguished, that that restlessness has been quelled, that people maybe are no longer seeking God because maybe they don't even build an altar to an unknown God anymore. Maybe their religiosity has dried up. Maybe their quest to be reunited with something divine is no longer there. But there are temples, and there are idols, and there are altars built to unknown gods that are offered to us and offered to the world every day. And they fail that very crucial test of solo dea gloria, to God alone be the glory, because they're hollow, because they're stone, because they are not life themselves. And even if it's not golden calves and bulls that people worship anymore, it is all that society has to offer. It is the passion of the flesh. It is the prurient interests and pursuits like that that Augustine dealt with. But it's also the secret knowledge that's whispered to us again and again and again, 1,000 times a day from 1,000 different voices across the whole of the media landscape. You're searching for truth? Go Google it. You can find it. You're searching for wisdom? There's an answer out there. You can find it. You're searching for something that you don't quite know how to name, and the whole of the world will offer you some sort of answer. And people still search, and souls are still restless. And faith, the faith that we have been given, not only saves us, but the faith that we have been given is meant for the salvation of the rest of the world as well. Salvation given to us calms our soul so that we can speak to the restless souls of others, so that we can go and be Paul in Athens and tell the people the hard truth, that the altar to the unknown God, well, maybe it's just an idol, but maybe it's something that we know that's been hidden from them. Maybe it's something that's been passed down to us in a long line of ancestors who have given us this truth, this stellar truth of who God is and what our relationship with God should be. And maybe we're called at this moment, in a world that is listening, to simply get up and speak. And I think people will listen. They won't all be persuaded. And our faithfulness is not measured in those terms. Our following God is not measured simply on how well we do. And our salvation certainly isn't merited by it either. But theirs might be. Theirs might be. Because the world is restless and pining and searching. And who will speak? And who will quiet the disquieted soul? And at one point in time, it was Augustine, after he found God. And at one point in time, it was Paul when he found God and lived out his faith. And at one point in time, at this appointed point in time, it's you. It's you. Because to God alone be the glory. And that's something the world needs to hear. Amen.